Good afternoon, students. Today is Friday, 5 March 2021. We're finally going to finish the topic of ACT utilitarianism today. This is our fourth lecture on Chapter 4. For the first lecture next week, I'd like you to read the first section of Chapter 5, which is on the topic of rule utilitarianism. And the first section of that chapter is entitled Primitive Rule Utilitarianism. Now, obviously, it would be nice if we could cover the whole chapter, in which many different types of rule utilitarianism are set out. But because we can't cover the whole book, I made a decision to cover just the simplest and perhaps most primitive type of rule utilitarianism to give you an idea of what it's all about. So please read the first section of Chapter 5 for the first videotape lecture next week. And then we're going to take up the topic of, we're going to spend 2 full days on rule utilitarianism. So both days next week will be on Chapter 5. But still, you need to read only that first section of the chapter. The week after that, which is also the first week after spring break, we will take up a new theory called ethical egoism. Now, I posted on Canvas a handout, which I'll get to a little bit later today. The title of it is The Place of Justice in Utilitarian Theory. And you can see it's got, I've copied mine on one sheet of paper, front and back, so it's a 2-page handout. And Smart, the author of that piece, JJC Smart, has some nice examples that are actually as good as or better than the examples that Feldman gives. So let's begin. Today's topic is the section entitled Problems About Justice. So we don't need to go too far into the topic of justice, but I want to give you some idea of what justice is, and then we'll see why utilitarianism has a problem with it. On page 59, Feldman says that ACT utilitarianism, quote, is unable to account for some facts about justice and injustice, unquote. Now, what is justice? Let me give you a couple of definitions. One definition of justice is that it's giving people what they're due, giving each person what he or she is due. So if you get a final score in this course of 90 or higher, then justice requires that you get an A in the course, because that's how I set the course up. Those are the rules. And if you follow the rules and you get 90 or more, then you deserve an A in the course. And if you get anything other than an A, that would be an injustice to you. I would be doing an injustice to you. Actually, strictly speaking, if you had a score of 85, if your final score was 85 and you got an A, strictly speaking, that's an injustice, because you got more than you deserved. Justice requires that you get exactly what you deserve, no more and no less. Now, we don't typically think of suppose someone got an 85 and ended up with an A. We don't typically think that that's an injustice. In fact, the person who gets the A probably won't complain about it at all. If, on the other hand, you had a score of 95 and you got a B, you would surely complain. And you would have a basis for your complaint. You would say that I treated you unfairly or unjustly. So one sense of justice, or one definition of justice, is that it consists of giving people what they deserve, giving people what they're due, D-U-E. Now there's another type of justice as well, and that has to do with distributions of things. When we distribute good things like money or income or wealth, and when we distribute bad things like taxation or military service, we need to see to it that they're distributed fairly. People who are similarly situated should be treated the same, and people who are differently situated should be treated differently in proportion to their differences. So if 2 people ended up with a score of 95 in the course, then they need to be treated the same way. They both need to be given the A that they have earned. What if I gave one of the 95s an A and the other one a B? I'm not only being unjust to the person who gets the B for the reasons I gave a moment ago. But now there's an additional injustice, and that is I'm treating two people who are relevantly similar differently. One of them who got the 95 gets an A, one of them who got the 95 gets a B. So there's a double injustice for the person who ends up with a B. Do you see that? First of all, you didn't get what you deserve, and secondly, you weren't treated equally with someone who received the same score that you did. So when you hear the term justice, realize that there are different theories of justice, and I've just given you two of the most common theories, and they both go back to Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher from the ancient world. Aristotle wrote all about justice and many other topics, and we have all learned a great deal from studying his works. Also notice that the differences must be relevant. What if I assigned grades in this course based upon the height of my students? Suppose I ranked students from tallest to shortest at the end of the semester, and I assigned grades in accordance with that. So the tallest people ended up with an A, and then another chunk of people below them ended up with B, C, D, and F. Surely that would be unjust, because height is irrelevant to the grade that you receive in this course. How you perform on the exams is relevant. In other words, it has a bearing on the grade that you end up with. Height is irrelevant. It has no bearing on the grade you end up with, and it should have no bearing. And there are a lot of irrelevant considerations. An instructor has to avoid taking irrelevant things into account in assigning grades. So it's irrelevant whether I like you or not. Now, professors have a natural affection for certain students, and who knows why. They may see themselves in that student, or they may like the student's enthusiasm or work ethic or something like that. And there are other students a professor may take a dislike to or a disliking to for various reasons. One student may come across as loud and obnoxious, and the professor may dislike that student as a result. But what I'm telling you is that no professor should take those kinds of things into account. Whether you like or dislike a particular student has no bearing on the grade that that student deserves and should end up with. Okay, so likability is irrelevant, height is irrelevant, hair color is irrelevant, that sort of thing. What is relevant is the student's performance on the required tasks of the course, in this case, examinations. Okay, now let's turn to an actual example. Utilitarianism says that how happiness is distributed is irrelevant. In fact, you know that already, because if you go back to the handout entitled Jeremy Bentham's Felicific Calculus, one of the important lessons that we learned when we studied that handout is that how happiness or unhappiness gets distributed makes no difference to the rightness or wrongness of the act. The only thing that matters is how much total happiness each act produces once you subtract the unhappiness from it. So let's call that net happiness. What you do is you evaluate each of the various acts that are available to you at that moment. You calculate the net happiness of each of them, and then whichever one has the highest total of net happiness is the right act to perform. In fact, it's not only the right act, it's obligatory. Remember that. And every other act other than that one is forbidden. So unless there's a tie at the top of the ranking, utilitarianism says the highest ranked act is obligatory and all the other ones are forbidden. No matter how close they come to that highest ranked act, they're still forbidden, which means that they're wrong. It's wrong to perform those acts and right not to perform them. So to a utilitarian, just to repeat myself, the way happiness is distributed is irrelevant. It makes no difference to the rightness of an act. But now let's shift our focus for a moment. We've been talking just now about how happiness is distributed. What about how money or some other resource is distributed? Does it matter to a utilitarian how that is distributed? And the answer is yes, it may well matter. The utilitarian position is this, that things like money and drugs and other resources should be distributed in whichever way maximizes total happiness, whichever way. And that could turn out to be a very unequal distribution. So let's take a look at an example and see what Feldman says about it. It's on page 59 of the book. We'll call it the dictator case for short. And without going ahead and reading it, I think I can give you the basic facts off the top of my head. Suppose there's a dictator who wants to raise money through taxation. The dictator considers two different tax plans or taxation schemes, whatever you want to call them. In one of the schemes, all the citizens are taxed at the same rate, let's say 10%. And that uniform tax rate will bring in a certain amount of money for the dictator to use to run the government. Another scheme involves taxing half the citizens at the rate of 20% and the other half at the rate of 0%. And we can suppose that the dictator, being a dictator, has certain people whom he or she favors and others who are not favored. So the people who are favored by the dictator don't have to pay any taxes at all. The people who are not favored or who are disfavored have to pay 20% each in taxes. Now, if we assume that the number of people who are paying taxes and the number of people who are paying no taxes is the same, that scheme will raise just as much money for the dictator as the original scheme, where everyone paid the same percentage, 10. So here we have two tax schemes that raise the same amount of money, and yet they distribute the burden of taxation very differently. One of them does it in a uniform way, the other one does it in an unequal, non-uniform way. According to act utilitarianism, or U sub 7, which is our correct version of act utilitarianism, the dictator should be indifferent between these two tax schemes. What I mean by that is the dictator should have no preference for one over the other because they bring in the same amount of money. And so act utilitarianism implies that either tax scheme would be right or morally permissible. And yet that seems unacceptable. I don't know about you, but I would think that one of those two tax schemes is morally preferable to the other one, the one where the tax burden is distributed equally throughout society rather than unequally. So the problem that this case supposedly poses for act utilitarianism is that it shows that inequality doesn't matter. The way resources or burdens are distributed doesn't matter to a utilitarian. If they matter to you, then you have a reason to reject U sub 7. So the argument goes like this. This is my reconstruction of the argument, not Feldman's. So listen carefully. If U7 is true, then we should be indifferent between the two tax schemes, since each of them would bring in the same amount of money. Second premise, we should not be indifferent between the two tax schemes. We should prefer one of them to the other. Specifically, we should prefer the equal distribution of tax burden to the other one. Therefore, by modus tollens, U sub 7 is false. So this would be an argument against U sub 7. And the argument is simply that it allows for unequal distribution of good and bad things like taxation or food, wealth, opportunity, and so on. The problem is utilitarianism seems to take no account of how things are distributed. Now here's Feldman's objection. This is what Feldman describes on page 60, and this has to do with the dictator case. premise number 1, if U sub 7 is true, then the only moral reason for preferring one distribution of goods over another is that one would produce more utility than the other. That's the first premise. Second premise, it's not the case that the only moral reason for preferring one distribution of goods over another is that it would produce more utility than the other. Another reason is that one might be more just than the other. So we can think of justice here as requiring an equal tax burden. And the problem with utilitarianism is it doesn't care how equal the burden is, as long as the total amount of utility is the same, is maximized. The conclusion of this argument, of course, is that U sub 7 is false, or not true. So once again, we have a modus tollens argument. The first premise draws out an implication from the theory that is unacceptable. And the second premise states that it's unacceptable. And the conclusion is the theory, therefore, is not true. Now, a utilitarian can reply to this in either of two ways. The utilitarian can try to find a way to deny the first premise. The utilitarian can try to find a way to show that the theory does not actually have that implication. The other alternative to the utilitarian is to bite the bullet and simply accept that the only moral reason for preferring one distribution to another is the total amount of utility that it produces. So this should be familiar by now. I told you that we're going to be seeing these modus tollens argument forms repeatedly for the rest of the course. So let's turn now, in what remaining time we have, and let's go over this handout that I prepared for you in some detail. It has some diagrams on it that I'll refer you to. If you have not yet printed this out and do not yet have it in front of you, you need to pause the video right now, go get it. Go to Canvas, print it, and come back and turn the video back on, because I'm going to be pointing to particular cells in these diagrams, and you're just going to be lost if you don't have this in front of you. Okay, J.J.C. Smart, who died a few years ago at the age of 90, was a great philosopher. He was born in Scotland. He emigrated to Australia when he was 30 years old, back in 1950, and he lived the rest of his long life in Australia. So I guess you could call him Scots-Australian. Smart was a utilitarian. He wrote books and articles explaining and defending utilitarianism. He specifically was an act utilitarian, and that's the theory we're talking about right now. So what Smart is going to do in this excerpt from one of his articles, he's going to explain, and this is the title, The Place of Justice in Utilitarian Theory. And if you want, you can replace the word justice with equality. It's the place of equality in utilitarian theory. So I'm going to read about half of the first paragraph, and then I'll pause and talk about what I just read to you. Then we're going to move on and read the second paragraph, which contains an example. And then when we're done with that, we'll turn the handout over and finish things up. So here we go. Listen carefully. According to Smart, the concept of justice as a fundamental ethical concept is really quite foreign to utilitarianism. A utilitarian would compromise his utilitarianism if he allowed principles of justice or equality, which might conflict with the maximization of happiness, or more generally of goodness, should he be an ideal utilitarian. He is concerned, the utilitarian, the act utilitarian, he is concerned with the maximization of happiness and not with the distribution of it. Nevertheless, he may well deduce from his ethical principle that certain ways of distributing the means to happiness, for example, money, food, housing, taxation, are more conducive to the general good than are others. So what I'm about to say is very, very important, and you've got to grasp what I'm saying and keep it in mind, including when you take the exam. There are two things we can distribute. We can distribute happiness itself, or we can distribute what Smart calls the means to happiness. When it comes to the former, happiness itself, we know, because we've gone over this before, including again today, that how happiness is distributed is irrelevant. It doesn't matter at all to an act utilitarian. It's only the total amount that matters. But when it comes to the means to happiness, how they're distributed might well matter. And it typically does matter. Right? The means to happiness are things like money. Money is a means to happiness. Now, I know you've probably heard the old saying, money can't buy happiness. And maybe that's true. But money is somehow related to happiness. I think that the connection is contingent rather than necessary. The more money you have, the more likely it is that you will be happy, because you will be able to purchase things that conduce to your happiness or that make you happy. Money is a means to happiness, certainly, even if it doesn't guarantee happiness. I think that's the force of the saying that money can't buy happiness. I think what that means is there's no guarantee that having money will make you happy, or that having more money than you do will make you happier. But that doesn't mean that there's not a probability that more money will make you happy. So money is one of those things that is a means to happiness. Other things that Smart lists are food, right? If you're starving, you're going to be very unhappy, miserable, in fact. If you have food, some amount of food, it will bring a certain amount of happiness to you, if only to stave off hunger pangs. And if you have more food, you may derive even greater pleasure and even greater happiness, because you can afford delicacies, fancy pastries and sweets and chocolate, things like that. So food can be thought of as a means to happiness, just like money. And Smart also mentions housing. Right? People who are devoid of housing or destitute of housing are probably out living on the street, and they're subject to the elements, cold and heat and rain and hail, things like that, wind. Whereas people who have housing are shielded from the elements and are therefore more likely to be happy. Now, you can plug in other things as well. Smart lists money, food, housing. He just gives 3 examples, but also clothing is a means to happiness. Fuel, fuel in the form of wood or coal, something to generate heat on a cold day to keep you warm, would promote your happiness. So Smart's point is that how the means to happiness are distributed could very well matter to a utilitarian. So let's start looking at some of his examples, and you'll see at the end of it exactly what he's talking about. I'm going to skip down to the next full paragraph on the handout. It's right here on the first page, about halfway on the sheet. So this is Smart talking. He says, as a utilitarian, therefore, I do not allow the concept of justice as a fundamental moral concept. But I am nevertheless interested in justice in a subordinate way, as a means to the utilitarian end. Thus, even though I hold that it does not matter in what way happiness is distributed among different persons, provided that the total amount of happiness is maximized, I do, of course, hold that it can be of vital importance that the means to happiness should be distributed in some ways and not in others. So here's his first example to illustrate that point. And you can see that I prepared a diagram for you. The diagram was not in the original article. The words were, but I, looking at Smart's example, I decided that it would be nice to encapsulate it in a chart so that you could see visually what he's talking about. Suppose that I have the choice of 2 alternative actions as follows. I can either give $500 to each of 2 needy men, Smith and Campbell, or else give $1,000 to Smith and nothing to Campbell. So before we analyze it and decide what the right thing to do is, look at the diagram that I prepared for you on that page. On the left side, I have A sub 1 and A sub 2. Those are the two acts that SMART is talking about, right? And you'll see across the top, I put Smith, Campbell, and the total. So all this does is show how much money was given to each person by each act. If I perform act A sub 1, I end up giving $500 to Smith and $500 to Campbell, which totals $1,000. If, on the other hand, I perform act A sub 2, I give $1,000 to Smith and $0 to Campbell, which also adds up to $1,000. Now here's how SMART analyzes that situation. He says, it is, of course, likely to produce the greatest happiness if I divide the money equally. For this reason, utilitarianism can often emerge as a theory with egalitarian consequences. And the word egalitarian means based on equality. In other words, the theory can have consequences that generate equal distributions. If it does so, this is because of the empirical situation and not because of any moral commitment to egalitarianism as such. So let's stop right there before he goes on to another example. Let me explain what he's saying here. SMART is saying that because money, how should I put this? There's a law in economics called the law of diminishing marginal utility of money. And let me explain what that means, because I think you'll understand it pretty easily as soon as you hear it. How much utility you get out of a dollar depends on how many dollars you already have. So suppose you have $10. If I give you an 11th dollar, that will have probably a pretty large effect on your utility, because that represents 1/10 of your wealth. You already had 10, now you've got an additional dollar to bring it up to 11. That's 1/10 of your wealth added to it. What if you have $1,000 and I give you $1? That additional dollar constitutes only 1/1000th of your wealth. And it probably won't make as big a difference to your utility as it made to the first person. So what that shows you is that the utility of a dollar depends on how many dollars you already have. Imagine someone who has $1 billion. If I give that person $1, that will make no appreciable impact on that person's utility. The person with $1 billion won't even notice that additional dollar. But if I had only $10, I would surely notice that 11th dollar. Okay, that might make a difference between getting something to eat and not having something to eat. And if I had $11 and you took one away from me, surely I would miss it, because now I'm down to just 10. So this is called the law of diminishing marginal utility of money. And that, I'm sure that's what SMART has in mind when he analyzes this case. So suppose I initially gave Smith the whole $1,000 and Campbell had none. Now, Smith is going to have a certain amount of utility from having that $1,000, and Campbell is going to have a certain amount of utility. In fact, none. Right? There's no money that can be a means to any happiness or utility. Now, suppose that's the initial distribution, 1,000 for Smith, 0 for Campbell. Would I increase utility, decrease utility, or leave utility about the same if I took $1 from Smith and gave it to Campbell? Smith now has $999. Campbell now has 1. Now Campbell's utility just went up somewhat because Campbell has $1, whereas before Campbell had none. Probably Campbell's utility will go up more than Smith's utility went down, because Smith still has $999 and won't miss that $1 very much. But for Campbell, that could be the difference between going hungry that day and having a bowl of soup at a restaurant counter or a candy bar. Okay, but we could keep going with this. If we took another dollar from Smith, reducing Smith's total to $9.98, and gave it to Campbell, Campbell now has $2. That transfer will probably also increase net utility, right? Because the utility that Campbell derives from that additional dollar is greater than the utility lost by Smith from having that dollar taken away. Now, you can imagine this process recurring over and over again. When would we stop transferring money from Smith to Campbell if our goal is to maximize utility? We would probably keep going until they have the same amount of money. So what if Smith had $5.01 and Campbell had $4.99? We would probably increase overall utility by taking the one from Smith and giving it to Campbell, which makes them each have $500. Now, if we took one more dollar from Smith, that would knock Smith down to $4.99 and make Campbell $5.01. And probably that would decrease utility more by taking a dollar away from Smith than by giving an extra dollar to Campbell. So Smart doesn't say this, but almost certainly he's talking here about the law of diminishing marginal utility of money. The distribution of money that comes out equal would probably produce more overall utility than any other distribution. The one that has 1,000 and 0, the one that has 999 and 1, the one that has 750, 250, the one that has 501 to 499, the one that has 499 to 501, and so on. There are a lot of combinations. So when Smart says it is, of course, likely to produce the greatest happiness if I divide the money equally, the reason for that is this law of diminishing marginal utility of money. Okay? And so utilitarians can rely on that law to support an equal distribution of things like money and food and housing and other means of happiness. Okay, you still with me? Let's go on to Smart's second example. He says, consider, for example, another empirical situation in which the $500 was replaced by a half dose of a life-saving drug, in which case the utilitarian would advocate giving 2 half doses to Smith or Campbell and none to the other. And turn the sheet over. You'll see at the top of the second page another diagram that I prepared for you. And let's take a look at it to make sure we understand the situation, then we'll analyze it. The two acts are A sub 1 and A sub 2. You'll see Smith, Campbell, and total at the top of the chart again. Act A sub 1 is where I give half a dose of medicine to each of the two. The total amount is 1 dose. Okay, half a dose to Smith, half a dose to Campbell, total amount of dosage 1 dose. The second thing I can do is give a full dose to Smith and no dose at all to Campbell. Or, of course, I can flip it around and give a full dose to Campbell and no dose to Smith. But let's stick with this one because it serves the purpose. The total is, once again, 1 dose. So what this shows is that there are 2 different ways for me to distribute my 1 dose of medicine. And keep in mind, this is not like the candy example from Feldman. Remember that example of the twins? Because the candy in that case, we assumed, could not be broken up and given half to each twin for whatever reason. But this medicine, we're now assuming, can be broken up and divided, half and half. So the question is, what should I do? Well, Smart goes on to point out, he probably should have said this earlier than he does. He said, in parentheses, I'm assuming that a whole dose would preserve life and that a half dose would not. So keep that in mind. That's an important fact about this situation. A full dose of the drug will save a life, but a half dose will not. So giving someone half a dose is tantamount to giving that person no dose at all. The person's going to die in either event. So here is how SMART analyzes it. He says, indeed, he said earlier that he said the $500 is replaced by a half dose of a life-saving drug, in which case the utilitarian would advocate giving 2 half doses to Smith or Campbell and none to the other. So which of the two acts is right according to SMART? According to ACT utilitarianism, Act A sub 2 is the right act. That's the act where a whole dose was given to one of the two and no dose at all was given to the other one. Now, how do we decide which one to give the whole dose to? Well, we might want to flip a coin or do something to randomize it. And we could explain it to the two men or to the two people. We could say, look, I have 1 dose of medicine. It will do good only if one of you gets the whole dose. So one of you will probably survive and the other will probably perish. And that's very unfortunate. I wish it weren't so. But that's what we're dealing with here. We've got a tragedy in the making. But if I gave each of you half a dose, it would compound the tragedy. You would both die. So the two men, Smith and Campbell, would understand the situation and probably would agree that there should be some random procedure to determine which of them gets it. Each would then have a 50-50 chance of living and a 50-50 chance of dying. And as long as they believed that the procedure was fair, like flipping a fair coin, I think they could accept the result. They won't be happy. The one who doesn't get the dosage won't be happy because he is going to die, but at least there won't be a sense of unfairness or wrongness. Okay, back to SMART. Let's see how he analyzes this. He said, indeed, if Smith and Campbell each possessed a half dose, it would be right to take one of the half doses and give it to the other. Wow. So utilitarian would go beyond simply handing out dosages. The utilitarian would actually intervene and forcibly take half a dose from one of them and give it to the other one. Because remember, the utilitarian's goal is to do whatever it takes to maximize happiness. And that may require force or even coercion from time to time. Smart goes on to say, he says, I'm also assuming a simplified situation. In some possible situations, especially in a society of non-utilitarians, the wide social ramifications of taking a half dose from Smith and giving it to Campbell might conceivably outweigh the good results of saving Campbell's life. Now, I probably could have ignored that because it's just a complication, but I think you can see what he's saying. Let me explain it. Smart is saying that there might be a certain amount of fear in society if people know that their possessions may be taken from them forcibly and given to others for the greater good. And if there is such fear, that would be a dolor. That would be a form of unhappiness. And that would have to be taken into account by the utilitarian. And conceivably, the amount of fear that would be instilled in people by knowing that they might have their drugs and other possessions taken forcibly from them, that conceivably could outweigh the good that's done by intervening. So it could turn out that it's wrong to intervene because it does more harm than good from a utilitarian vantage point. Okay, Smart does say, following that, it is probable, notice he's not saying it's certain, but it's probable or likely that in most situations, the equal distribution of the means to happiness will be the right utilitarian action, even though the utilitarian has no ultimate moral commitment to egalitarianism. So he's repeating himself because it's an important point. The utilitarian has no commitment per se to an equal distribution. The only commitment that the utilitarian has to equal distribution is empirical or contingent. And that comes back to the law of diminishing marginal utility of money, food, housing, and so on. There's a kind of built-in pressure toward equality, and that has to do with the fact that how much utility you derive from some good thing depends on how much of it you have already. Okay, we're almost done. A couple more examples. The whole purpose of this handout is to help show you how a utilitarian thinks about justice and equality. All right, next situation. If a utilitarian is given the choice of two actions, one of which will give 2 units of happiness to Smith and 2 to Campbell, and the other of which will give 1 unit of happiness to Smith and 9 to Campbell, he will choose the latter course. So look at my chart that I prepared, and you'll see the various options. Act A sub 1. Whatever I do, whatever that act amounts to, Smith ends up 2 units happier, and so does Campbell. And that means that act produces a net balance of plus 4 units of happiness, which is another way of saying that if I perform act A sub 1, I have made the world 4 units happier than it was. But maybe I can do better. Let's look at A sub 2. In A sub 2, I end up making Smith 1 unit happier than Smith was, and Campbell is now 9 units happier. When you add 1 and 9 together, you get plus 10. So, what is the right thing to do? Notice we're distributing happiness now, not the means to happiness, like money or food or housing or drugs. When you're distributing happiness, as Bentham taught us, all you look for is the final column, right? The bottom line, if you want to change the metaphor. Which of these two actions produces the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness? It's act A sub 2, because we've made the world 10 units happier by performing that act, whereas we would make the world only 4 units happier if we performed act A sub 1. So what's the significance of this example? What point does it make? What it shows you is that the unequal distribution of happiness is the right thing to do. Notice, act A sub 1 distributes happiness equally, plus 2, plus 2. The second act distributes happiness very unequally, plus 1, plus 9. Campbell is very happy about A sub 2. Campbell says, yes, I'm 9 units happier. If you had performed A sub 1, I would be only 2 units happier. So the right act, according to an act utilitarian, is A sub 2, even though the distribution of happiness is quite unequal. That's the point Smart is making right there. Okay? It's a point we made earlier when we went over the handout entitled Jeremy Bentham's Felicific Calculus. I already made this point several lectures ago. And now Smart, you can see that Smart is making the same point Bentham did. Okay, one more example. It's similar to that one, but it's got a little extra twist. Smart says, it may also be that I have the choice between 2 alternative actions, one of which gives minus 1 unit of happiness to Smith. In other words, it makes Smith 1 unit less happy, and plus 9 units to Campbell. Okay, that's act A sub 1. It has minus 1 in Smith under Smith and plus 9 under Campbell. What's the total? Plus 8. When you sum minus 1 and plus 9, you get plus 8. And the second act gives plus 2 to Smith and plus 2 to Campbell for a total of plus 4. Once again, we're dealing with happiness and how it's distributed. How happiness is distributed is irrelevant to a utilitarian. Okay? How money is distributed is not irrelevant. It's quite relevant. It matters. But how happiness is distributed is irrelevant. It doesn't matter at all. Only the final total amount. So which action is right according to U sub 7? you can see it's act A sub 1. Why is it right? Because 8 plus 8 is greater than plus 4. Now, act A sub 1 is right even though what? What's the point Smart is making here? Act A sub 1 is the right thing to do even though someone is made unhappy, namely Smith. In the first example, there were only plus marks, plus signs, no minuses. In the second example, we've got someone who is made worse off in terms of happiness. But that doesn't matter, does it? Campbell's additional units of happiness, which is 9, simply swamps the -1. So even though act A sub 2 produces an equal distribution of happiness, that doesn't make it right. In fact, that has no bearing on whether it's right. It's irrelevant. Irrelevant means has no bearing on, makes no difference to. Okay, so the right thing to do is act A sub 1, even though it produces an unequal distribution of happiness, indeed, even though someone is made unhappy as a result of it. Smart says, to end his discussion, as a utilitarian, I will choose the former course. So Smart is a hard-headed act utilitarian. He has no compunction whatsoever in saying that we should distribute one full dose of a drug, a life-saving drug, to one of the two and nothing at all to the other one. Why? Because that's the only distribution that will actually save a life. And he then adds, to show how hard-headed he is, and I don't mean hard-headed in the sense of stubborn, I just mean willing to make morally difficult decisions. He says if Smith and Campbell each have a half dose of the drug and they're not willing to give, neither one is willing to give the other one his half, Smart says someone else would be justified in forcing one of them to give up his half and give it to the other one, because that would be to save a life, and leaving them each with their own half would end up with both of them dead. So Smart is a clear-thinking, hard-headed utilitarian. Smart also is a notorious bullet biter. J.J.C. Smart is one of those utilitarians who says, I'm going to stick with my theory come what may. If my theory implies something that makes me queasy or causes me pain or makes me doubt my instincts, I'm going to stick with my theory. I have more confidence that my theory is correct than I do in my hunches or my intuitions. In fact, Smart thinks that most of our intuitions come from disreputable sources. Smart has said in his writings that most of our intuitions come from our religion, if any. And for Smart, who's a famous atheist, religion is a superstition. Many of our intuitions are rooted in ignorance, Smart has said, has written. So if our intuitions come from disreputable sources like superstition and ignorance and simply believing what other people around you believe, then we're better off formulating a theory that seems correct on its own merits and simply accepting whatever results it produces. And that's the definition of bullet biting, isn't it? Right? A bullet biter says, my theory implies X. Therefore, I'm going to accept X no matter whether it goes against my intuitions, no matter whether it causes me pain or makes me queasy or anything like that. So Smart is a hard-headed, clear-thinking act utilitarian. He's a joy to read. If you'd like to read something by J.J.C. Smart, send me an email and I'll direct your attention to one of his writings, and you can see how clear his writing is and how interesting he is. And he was a wonderful, kind man as well. Everybody loved him. They called him Jack. I wrote to him many years ago with a question. He wrote back, even though he was then quite old. He wrote back right away by email, and I think I wrote back again, and he responded again. I was very grateful for that. I felt like I was in touch with a really, truly great philosopher, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century in my judgment. And I know all about Smart because I wrote an encyclopedia entry on him for an encyclopedia of utilitarianism several years ago. It required that I round up and read and analyze everything he had ever written on ethics. And I think it was 37 books and articles that Smart had written in the course of his life on ethical topics. And I gathered them, I read them, I analyzed them, and I distilled it all into a 3 or 4 page encyclopedia entry. It took about a year for me to do it, but it was well worth it. I learned a lot about utilitarianism, about ethics, and it gave me a new appreciation for the man and the brilliance of his mind. So that's partly why I posted this for you, because Smart shows you with a series of examples exactly what utilitarianism says about justice and equality and what it doesn't say about it. Okay, final thought before we leave for today. On page 60, now that we're done with Act Utilitarianism, we've spent a lot of time on it, and we're about to move on to another theory finally. Although it's still a form of utilitarianism, at least it's called rule utilitarianism, and it's different from act utilitarianism. They're both types of utilitarianism, but they diverge, and I'll explain how in my next lecture. Smart says on page 60, having spent several chapters on this theory, quote, "There seems no way to determine whether act utilitarianism has been refuted." So you might say the theory has been mortally wounded, but maybe it's not dead yet. Right? Maybe it'll recover. Maybe it can be salvaged. Utilitarians certainly haven't given up on it just because it's been widely criticized. People like Jack Smart went to his grave believing that it was the correct theory of right and wrong, and many others agree with that. Others think that the theory suffers from fatal problems. So to this day in philosophy, in academic philosophy, there are people who are proud utilitarians who work in the tradition of Bentham, Mill, and Sidgwick, and Smart. And there are people who think that utilitarianism is wrong-headed, that it takes the wrong approach altogether to right and wrong, and that the sooner we're rid of it, the better. So, like many things in life, the debate rages on between the utilitarian crowd and the non-utilitarian crowd. In the rest of the course, once we're done with rule utilitarianism, we will take up alternative theories, such as egoism, Kantianism, and eventually Rawlsian pluralism. And you can make up your own mind at the end of the course which theory, if any, is the most promising. My goal, again, in this course is to expose you to the main theories, normative ethical theories. At no point am I trying to persuade you to subscribe to a particular theory or not to prescribe to any particular theory. So Feldman says that he's going to assume, at this point, assume for the sake of convenience that act utilitarianism has been refuted. He doesn't claim that he's refuted it or that any of these critical arguments refute it, but he says, let's just assume that it's refuted and move on and discuss other theories and see what they have to say. Okay, that's it for today. We're almost an hour in. So this is our second lecture for this week. Have a great day and have a nice weekend. And there will be 2 lectures next week on rule utilitarianism. So I'll see you then on the screen.